let's move on to the next point. Politics. Let's talk about some political leaders. Now, once again, we are not political commentators, and I'm not the most knowledgeable when it comes to politics. Try to keep myself as well informed as I can, but there was a story that I noticed. So even though I live in the Dominican Republic, I still keep up on my Australian news, and there was something that hit my radar a few days ago. Now, all these things are obviously at the time of this recording. There's obviously going to be changes by the time it's been released, but at the time of this recording, a few days ago, maybe it was about a week ago, there was a news article, lots of news articles about our former Prime Minister, ScoMo, good old Scott Morrison. Now, he has been up to some, they would say, some dirty tricks. Now, once again, we don't know all the story. We don't know the real reason behind it, but it was very interesting when I was putting this together and looking at the F1 and all these behind-the-scenes contracts and everything that are being done, that it was funny that when we talk about politics that Scott Morrison had done something very similar. Scott Morrison has been accused. Don't know exactly what the extent of everything is at the moment because he's still under only accusation. There's investigation and everything. But apparently, Scott Morrison had appointed, during COVID, while he was Prime Minister, had appointed himself as Minister of 5 different departments without anyone knowing. Now, apparently, like we were saying before, legally, apparently it's right, but it's not with integrity, I suppose, the right way to say it, and not even his ministers knew. Now, his argument about the situation was, well, I was doing it because COVID was his thing, and if any one of them got COVID, I could step in and take over and everything like that. And if that was his intention, Dr. Rod, if that was his intention, then wouldn't have you just done it with the notice of the minister? What's your take on? First of all, what's your impression of why all this happened?
Well, it seems to me that it happened for purely pragmatic reasons. It all started during COVID, and of course, as we know, most governments around the world paid no attention whatsoever to their infection disaster management type plans. So, in the case of Australia, as I'm sure in many other countries, there was a pandemic management plan. Australia's had been updated as recently as 2019, I believe. But for some reason, we looked at what China did, and everybody decided to follow China with lockdowns and all sorts of restrictions on freedom of individuals. And, so we all experienced something that the Chinese people experienced under the hand of the Communist Party. And politicians everywhere became, I guess, very pragmatic, and maybe they saw some opportunities to gain additional power. We certainly saw this in Australia, at both Commonwealth, but particularly at state level, where most health regulations sit. We had state border closures, which were unconstitutional, but the courts waved them through anyway, on the grounds that we had this pandemic and that it was a pragmatic thing to do, which really surprised me because I didn't really understand that that's how the law worked actually. But anyway, that's what happened. And maybe some legal professors might correct me on that. But as I understand it, these border closures shouldn't really have happened constitutionally, but they were kind of waved through by the High Court here in Australia. So there was all sorts of things happening which were unusual, undemocratic, and didn't follow the agreed plans for managing pandemics. And as was the case with the state premiers here in Australia and with leaders in many other parts of the world, our Prime Minister did some things which were unconventional. And
That's a very political way of saying it, Dr. Rod.
He did indeed become minister in 5 different areas. My understanding is that only 2 of them were really secret, as it were. By that I understand that the ministers concerned didn't know, so they didn't know that there was another minister who could overrule them. And the only other person who would have known, I believe, would have been the Governor-General, because the Governor-General in Australia is the Queen's representative. We're not a republic. We're a Commonwealth nation, and the Queen is actually formally the head of state, and she appoints a governor on the advice of the Prime Minister of the day. So the governor is the Queen's representative, and it is the governor that actually swears in ministers in the federal parliament. But they do that on the advice of the Prime Minister. So the Prime Minister can bowl up to the Governor-General and say, look, I'm the Prime Minister. My advice is that you should swear me in as the Minister for this, that and the other thing, and away it all goes. And as we so often hear in political areas, there was nothing illegal about it. And the current government, which is of a different political flavour, they've actually had legal advice which says just that. There was nothing illegal about it, but it did actually breach what have become conventions in terms of the way in which our parliament operates. And I think this raises the issue I touched on a little earlier. It might be legal, but is it the right thing to do? And I've got serious doubts about whether or not, particularly in the case of the two ministers who did not know that their Prime Minister was also Minister of their portfolio, and as Prime Minister being senior to them, he could actually overrule any of their decisions. Now, interestingly enough, part of Scott Morrison's defence was, well, I never actually used the powers, although I did once. But what interests me is the one time that he did overrule, a minister had nothing whatsoever to do with COVID. It had more to do with a looming election, because he used his powers to overrule what was likely to be a decision by the Minister for Resources, I think it was. And that was in relation to gas drilling just off Sydney. And the Prime Minister, in his capacity as Minister for Resources, actually said no to that gas drilling. We believe, and the political commentators have said, it was because he thought it was going to lose votes in certain key seats in metropolitan Sydney. Now, they lost all those seats anyway. But I just found it interesting that although his reason for taking on those ministries was in the event that the minister became ill or even died from COVID, there'd be a seamless sort of transfer of powers, or there would be a seamlessness about it, because he would just simply step in and start making decisions until such time as he'd be able, presumably, to allocate the portfolio to somebody else. I can't really see why the ministers didn't need to know and why Cabinet couldn't have known. Cabinet, keeps things secret. I do understand that under the pandemic conditions, maybe there were some things that needed to be kept from the public so that we wouldn't panic. So I wouldn't have a big issue with that. But what seems to me to be a significant issue is that the only time he ever used those powers, in my opinion, had absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with COVID. But interestingly, now there's going to be an inquiry, but the inquiry really is all about what the Prime Minister did. And I just think that's ridiculous, frankly, because the inquiry we actually need is an inquiry about everybody during the COVID pandemic, not just what the Prime Minister did, but what all the state premiers did. We had long and very damaging shutdowns. They didn't do just economic damage. They did social damage. They upset the fabric of our society, and they did psychological damage as well. The psychological damage in particular is only becoming apparent now. And the other thing too, of course, is we're now getting data on excess deaths. And I suppose the most or the best known is what's coming out of the United Kingdom at the moment. But I believe we've had something like 10,000 excess deaths in Australia that can't be attributed to COVID. They're now being attributed to things like delayed diagnoses and treatment of cancers and so on, because people were locked down. There was lots of stuff that wasn't going on in our hospitals and so on because they were setting aside beds and wards to deal with potential COVID cases. I think we need a broad-ranging inquiry, not just about that. And I think what's actually happening is being driven by political objectives. People basically want to do as much. I think what we're seeing is a government that wants to do as much damage as it can to the previous government through their prime minister. And I just think we shouldn't be wasting taxpayers' money on that, when the inquiry we really need, so that we can discover what lessons are to be learned, is a wide-ranging inquiry. I would say we need a royal commission. We need to know what was going on the part of the premiers and the chief health officers, as well as the prime minister. But I think the fundamental issue really boils down to this. I personally, I'm sick and tired of hearing politicians saying, but what I did was legal, because that isn't the big issue. The big issue is, was it the right thing to do under the circumstances? And look, there has to be room for debate on this. I don't think I can point you to a couple of scriptures in the Bible that give a definitive answer. And look, there are times when our political, business, church leaders and so on, they have to have a degree of confidentiality. But in this particular case, I find it very hard to understand why that couldn't have been cabinet confidential, that somehow it was impossible for the Prime Minister to divulge that information to anybody else. I mean, what might happen if the Prime Minister died of COVID, you know? Anyway, those are my thoughts. And as I say, look, we don't know all the ins and outs. We don't know everything that happens in cabinet and so on and so forth. But it does seem to me that the primary issue here is that whole issue, again, of distinguishing clearly between what is legal and what is right.
So let's look at, let's pull this back and what's relevant to leaders, the leaders that are watching, and they're in business, in churches, maybe they're in politics, or maybe just in general community, etc. So I think from my interpretation of this is at the base of it, it's going behind the back and not telling, some of them knew, but let's focus on the ones that didn't know. There should be no reason why you as a leader should be doing something behind the back of someone who has authority over that area. Maybe it's a team leader, maybe it's a manager, maybe you're the business owner and you're doing something behind your manager's back, or you're doing something that a team member has authority over, but you're doing it behind their back or whatever. For me, that comes down to trust, a lack of trust. Number one is, if you as a leader are doing things behind the back of the person who's responsible for that task or project or responsibility, you obviously don't trust them enough to be competent in their job. And on top of that, you doing that is now diminishing their trust for you, because now that this has come out about Scott Morrison doing this, no one can trust him. It's much harder now. Obviously it's been politicized and everything like that, but now you look at him and you go, you may have done good, but now you've just kind of ruined your reputation. We can't trust you because you've done deceitful things. How do we as leaders avoid doing things that show, trying to think about, because it's not necessarily that they're showing that distrust. The leader obviously doesn't trust the person. So what do you do when you don't trust someone to fulfill their role or fulfill their responsibilities?
Well, if you love them as you love your neighbour, you should go and talk to them. I think that's critically important. People have got to know where they stand with you. And, the thought that was going through my mind as you were speaking there is that a really important role of leadership is empowerment. Now, look, every textbook I've ever read about leadership places significant emphasis on the role of leaders as influencers. And that is important. If you're not influencing people, then you are not a leader. But
Exactly.
I also think leadership is about empowerment. So it's about giving people the authority to make decisions, as well as holding them accountable or holding them responsible for the outcomes of those decisions. But to find out after the fact that your boss can actually do your job and overrule every decision you've made, it's kind of retrospective, I know, but I think that's hugely disempowering. And one of the ministers involved publicly stated that, in her opinion, Scott Morrison should resign from the parliament altogether. In other words, she's saying his level of integrity is so low that he shouldn't even be in the parliament, even as a backbencher. He's not on the shadow ministry. But that might have been a little bit over the top. I'm not sure that should be the way he responds, but I can certainly understand it, because he was a minister,
the sentiment,
doing the best
that's why she feels
could under the circumstances. I've heard a lot of interviews with this minister. I do believe she was doing the best she could under the circumstances. She's a genuine and sincere person, and then discovers that her Prime Minister had the power to overrule any decision she made, COVID or no COVID. That is hugely disempowering. And I think that's the main damage done here. Now, the other thing, and this has to do with the flexibility or the capacity of a leader to actually lead. If the Prime Minister knew what he had done, and that it could be seen as lacking in integrity there or operating in secrecy, there's no way he could have called out the state premiers for doing something similar. In other words, acting in secrecy or lacking integrity. And he didn't. You see, I mean, I think many of us, we were looking for the Prime Minister to say to the premiers, "What are you doing? Look, it's almost certain that some people died because they couldn't get across borders. Almost, and the way I say almost certain is there haven't been any court cases, as far as I know, to actually test this. But there's certainly cases that came to the attention of the media where babies desperately in need of urgent treatment weren't able to get to the closest specialist hospital because borders were closed. And health officials said, no, we're not going to allow you to we're not going to lift our rules just for you. There were families where people were dying of cancer or other terminal illnesses. They couldn't see their loved ones. It was just dreadful. No good reason for it. But the Prime Minister wasn't calling the premiers out. And perhaps one of the reasons why he wasn't was that he felt he couldn't, because he'd already compromised on his own integrity. Now, I'm not accusing him of that. So don't get me wrong, because we don't know enough of the facts to be able to say that. But in terms of leadership, we need to be very careful we don't put ourselves in a position where we can't deal with issues because we've made a compromise ourselves. But I do think the biggest issue here is that a really fundamental role of leadership was undermined, and that is leaders not only influence people, leaders really need to empower people. I don't think you're a good leader if you're not always looking for ways of empowering the people whom you influence.
Definitely, 100%, 100%. We need to, people around us need to grow.
They do.
We need to see, people need to benefit around you. And if they're not benefiting, if you're taking things from them, how are they going to grow? Going back to you saying, have a conversation with them, because that's your job as a leader.
Yes,
if you don't trust them to do that role, then it's your responsibility to help build up their ability, build up their confidence, build up their experience, and train them. It's our responsibility to train them so we can trust them to do that. And if it wasn't, and if it's not a lack of trust that we don't trust them to do that, it was just a power grab, well, that's once again going back to that other thing, like it'll all come to bite us in the butt eventually, because if if you can't stand up with integrity, and like you're saying, he couldn't do his job properly, and we can't do our job properly as leaders if we're not with integrity. People say you got to walk the walk if you talk the talk. Like you've got to, you do have to live that out. I think it's an overused term, and I actually, unfortunately, see very few people in the public eye. They talk the talk, but it's very rarely do you see them walk the walk. And this is just a perfect example of that, is that Scott Morrison obviously wasn't able to walk the walk as the Prime Minister and lead during this time, because he obviously was I hate to over-spiritualize this, but being led by a spirit of deception. If he was doing deceptive things himself, he was being blinded to, or maybe avoided calling out because he didn't want a spotlight being put on him. And that's the same with us as leaders, that if we don't have integrity, if we can't stand with a spotlight on us, with Jesus, like we're going to be standing there. The Bible says that we that have been called to lead people actually have an extra question to answer for Jesus, that he holds us to account for the people he's held us responsible to. And if we can't stand up with integrity, saying, yes, we did everything we could. Now, we're not perfect. I'm not meant to be perfect at all, but we should be able to at least go, you know what? I did my best. I did the best with everything that I had available to me. And yeah, if we as leaders are lacking that trust, then we can't lead effectively, and we can't influence people effectively because they lose their trust in us. So
trust moves quickly,
that's a good point.
Trust moves quickly. In fact, Stephen Covey Jr. has written 2 books about the speed of trust.
Yes.
I'll tell you what, it's a very important currency in business in particular, and you can waste it very, very quickly.
Hey, you've just watched an excerpt from our On the Cube Leadership podcast. If you'd like to see the full episodes, check out our YouTube channel and consider subscribing.